Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second in our double bill of shows today. And if you didn't see the earlier one with Kit Koval, it's a fantastic one about conservatism in World War II, which is a much more interesting story than perhaps it sounds what I said about it just then. But anyway, welcome back. We love it when regular viewers make the leap and become guest historians. Following Scott Grimwood, history explorer Susan Yu, Norma Graham, and others is Rick Green, bring a story of two Canadians in Hong Kong and beyond in World War II. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Rick. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks, Woody.
And as I say, you've made that leap there. It's something that if you're watching this and you've got a story and you think you can make the leap from viewer to historian or to guest, it's possible to do. So please get in touch. So, Rick, you've been in the sidebar a lot. And I remember when you were first there, you were kind of always talking about the Far East and China and that aspect of World War II, rather than necessarily being someone talking about Arnhem and Montgomery. So you kind of were on my radar really early on for having a different slant to some people with regards to World War II. So how did this story come to your attention?
Well, I started with my focus on Asia in uni and I had an interest in the Cold War, but then with Gorbachev and Perestroika, I could see that was going to wind down. And then I thought, well, what's going to be the next up and coming power? And I decided that given with Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening, it was going to be China. So I studied China, and just my interest kind of grew from there. Then I ended up, after university, moving to Hong Kong and was there from 1991 to 1998. And I was cognizant of that time of the battle for Hong Kong because when I was a young teenager, my father told me that his unit that he was in, which I believe was a Canadian Scottish, was on the prospective list for Sea Force.
Right.
So he was potentially going to be sent to Hong Kong for the defense. And fortunately for him, he wasn't. So it's actually once I got involved in this show, I came across this show, and I saw the quality of the material that you were presenting here, that it inspired me to go back to my love for history and read up in more detail about the battle for Hong Kong. And interestingly, when you're doing this research and you have some sort of ideas in mind, or maybe even not, that you all of a sudden you make some connections, and it's like, oh, I didn't even realize that happened. And that's what happened here, is that I ended up finding out this particular Canadian, Kendall, who ended up meeting this other Canadian as a result of the battle for Hong Kong, that ultimately led to the Canadian Chinese being recruited for Force 136. And two of those recruits, it turned out, were great uncles of my wife. So I get this on the early side with the battle for Hong Kong, the connection through my father, and then with the later side of this story is actually a family connection through my wife's.
Well, brilliant. And it's interesting, this show is coming a couple of days after the panel discussion with Rob and John and Jack, because every conversation we had about Burma it's all about China. It's all about China, and China should be becoming more a part of the World War II lexicon and understanding, and it's sort of been relegated to the sidelines. And now, through the work of people like those gentlemen, it's becoming more of mainstream. But anyway, we're digressing to a rabbit hole already. So, folks, Rick is going to do the presentation kind of through in one go, really, and we'll save up questions for the end. I may jump in with the odd thing as we're going on, but we're going to let Rick riff. This was kind of intended to be a bit of a pairing with Susan's Yu's talk, which was actually quite a few months ago now. I can't remember exactly when it was, several hundred shows ago, I suppose, but it's ending up working that we're doing it now. So I'm going to hand over to Rick to do this, and we'll do questions at the end. So over to you, sir.
Thanks, Woody. So this story is based on the alternative view of change approach to history that's inspired by the BBC series Connections, presented by James Burke. So before I begin, I first want to say something about language. So in this presentation, where appropriate, I have adopted local names and terms in contemporary usage, giving reference to their archaic forms for clarity where necessary. as a purpose of history is to inform current and future generations of the past, I believe that people can more easily relate to stories when presented with place names used today, unless referring to an entity that no longer exists, like French Indochina. Another consideration in the usage of some archaic terms is their colonial origin, which may be considered derogatory or unwittingly evoke negative sentiments. Also related are names that may express a geographical or cultural bias. Far East, for example, sought to use generic terms that are neutral and broadly applicable wherever a presentation viewer is located. So looking at this map, you can see an additional difficulty for this story is what form of Chinese to apply to names of people and places. So considering the dominant language in Hong Kong and Guangdong is Cantonese, I primarily use that for those regions. Otherwise, standard Mandarin is adopted. Now to provide some context for this story. This map shows the extent of the Japanese expansion to the 6th of August, 1942. So if you notice along the coast of China between Shanghai and Hainan Island, how the Japanese have captured the main ports to interdict supplies to the Nationalist Chinese, but not consolidated the areas in between. So the blue shaded area is the extent of free China at that time. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that it's under direct control of the Chongqing government, only that it is not occupied by the Japanese. Also, for the purposes of this story, note the distance between Darwin in northern Australia and Hong Kong, which is approximately 3,000 nautical miles. For comparison, the distance between Pearl Harbor and Japan is roughly 3,500 nautical miles. So just to give you a sense of the distances involved here, which is, of course, creates a very different dynamic from Europe. This map shows the disposition of the Japanese in China at the end of the war and the communist base areas. For reference, Hong Kong is at the bottom right on the coast. Chongqing, Nationalist China's temporary wartime capital, is in the lower center on a line running right from the top of India. Flying distance between Hong Kong and Chongqing is 1,050 kilometers or 652 miles. Kunming, terminus of the Burma Road and the Hump, is in the middle of Yunnan province, just above Indochina at the bottom center of the map. And notice the communist base areas are concentrated around the northeast, but then also in the lower Changjiang River, which we also know as the Yangtze. Zooming into the Zhujiangkou, or the Pearl River estuary, Hong Kong and Macau straddle the mouth of the river. Macau consists of a peninsula and 2 islands. It was neutral Portuguese territory throughout the war. After the capitulation of Hong Kong, Macau served as the gateway for the West River escape route for civilians and POWs. Hong Kong consists of 4 parts: Hong Kong Island, the Kowloon Peninsula, the New Territories, and the outlying islands. To the east of Hong Kong is Dai Pengwan, called Mears Bay in English. The bay is enclosed on the east by the Dai Peng Peninsula. The East River escape route from Hong Kong went north from here to Huizhou, or Huizhou in Cantonese. So this story, I'm going to introduce the protagonists and then talk about how they figure in the battle for Hong Kong, then about their escape to free China, which ultimately led to their meeting and the development of the idea for what ended up being Operation Oblivion. I talk about the recruitment and training for the teams, which wasn't necessarily an easy thing, and then the promise that was given to the volunteers of what their service would ultimately lead to. Then afterwards, I'll mention how some of them ended up going into action, and then which ultimately was about the same time as when the Japanese surrendered. But for the volunteers, the surrender of the Japanese wasn't the end of the war. It was actually, they still had to win the fight for equality. Now to begin the story. From Oblivion to Triumph is a story about how 2 Vancouverites, because of the battle for Hong Kong, met in Free China, and changed Canadian history. In popular history, the Battle of Hong Kong is a story of futility and sacrifice, a mere 18-day prelude to the more significant catastrophes of Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. In many histories, this story ends on December 25th in room 336 of the Peninsula Hotel, with the ignominious signing by candlelight of the document of surrender by Hong Kong's governor, Sir Mark Atchison Young, what locals would call Black Christmas. Of course, the Battle of Hong Kong didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a web of interconnected events that for some represents the beginning of their story, like Elizabeth Ann Joffe, who was the first child born in the Stanley internment camp on January 27, 1942. For others, like Francis Woodley Kendall, or Mike as he preferred to be called, the Battle of Hong Kong unexpectedly enters the middle of their story and profoundly changes the course of their life. Born in Vancouver on August 22, 1907, Mike Kendall found employment in Hong Kong in 1933 as a consulting mining engineer working on projects in southern China. When the Japanese invaded Guangzhou on October 21, 1938, as part of their effort to block the supply of war material to the Nationalist Chinese, Kendall's work was made redundant. Also at that time, the mother and family of World War II TV patron Susan Yu fled Guangzhou for Yangon in what was then known as Burma. By the end of 1938, over 750,000 refugees had streamed across the border into Hong Kong. Kendall joined the medical department of the Hong Kong government as a consultant on refugee affairs, organizing relief and the building of refugee camps. In late 1939, he was approached by Section D of the British Secret Intelligence Service to, under cover of his work, set up an intelligence network with radio communications covering all Japanese-occupied territory, from Hainan Island in the south to Fuzhou opposite Taiwan on the east coast. Kendall succeeded in accessing an existing Nationalist Chinese network, which provided the Allies with high-quality intelligence. The following year, he was asked by Hong Kong's General Officer Commanding Arthur Edward Grasset to form a sabotage group under the Ministry of Economic Warfare, perhaps spurred on by Japan's June 25th occupation of Shenzhen just across the border from the colony. On July 17th, he was transferred from Essential Services to the Hong Kong Defense Reserve and began recruiting his team. It would include Robert Thompson, who would later become an authority on counterinsurgency after the war. This said special force, as it was known, was conceived by Kendall as a stay-behind group that would gather intelligence, encourage resistance, and engage in sabotage. It was based on the concept of British auxiliary units, which were formed in Britain in 1940 to provide a civilian resistance force against a German invasion. Andrew Chatterton, in his November 17, 2020 World War II TV show, Churchill's Secret Army, covers this in more detail. Richard Duckett discussed its application in Southeast Asia Command on his March 16, 2021 World War II TV show, the S.O.E. in Burma, Jungle Operations. In July of 1941, Kendall and his second-in-command, Eddie Teasdale, were sent on a 3-week training course at the Special Operations Executive's new Special Training School 101 in Singapore, which had only been established the previous month. Upon successful completion, they were recruited by, and Z Special Force was amalgamated into, S.O.E., becoming the Special Reconnaissance Unit. So therefore, contrary to the myth that Hong Kong was wholly unprepared for the Japanese invasion, Kendall and his men were preparing for exactly that up until the December 8th attack. They trained in weapons and explosives, set up supply dumps in the new territories, and spent much of their time just walking the ground to get to know the terrain. Another Canadian caught in the trauma of Hong Kong in 1941 was Zhang Gan, known in English as William Gun Chong. Bill was born in Vancouver on July 15, 1911. When he left school, unlike Mike Kendall, his future prospects in Canada were limited. Anti-Chinese discrimination had been building since their arrival in the 19th century, exacerbated by economic competition with whites for jobs. Already in 1875, the British Columbia legislature had rescinded the right for Chinese Canadians to vote in the province with the passage of the Qualifications and Registration of Voters Act. Since being on the voters list was one of the requirements for membership in a professional organization, the act also effectively barred Chinese from work in occupations such as architecture, law, or medicine. Efforts to limit Chinese immigration then began with the imposition of a $50 head tax in 1885. The tax was incrementally increased until 1904, when it was raised to $500, the equivalent of over 13,000 Canadian dollars today. Anti-Asian sentiment in Vancouver came to a climax on September 7, 1907, when a mob drawn from an Asiatic Exclusion League meeting descended on Chinatown, smashing windows and terrorizing its inhabitants. Still, the Chinese came to Canada. Eventually, in response, the federal government passed the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923, resulting in a near outright ban to entry, deepening the predominantly Chinese bachelor society in Vancouver at that time. Bill's career began with work at a produce company, then helping a friend run a grocery store. After the shop went out of business, he was hired as a cook boy by George Kidd, an expatriate Englishman who was the retired chairman of the British Columbia Electric Company. According to Bill, he was typical English, very humorous. Everything he said meant so much, and I learned a lot from him. That's why the British like me, because they thought I was British. When the war broke out in Europe on September 1st, 1939, like many Chinese in Canada, Bill volunteered for military service. However, due to pressure from British Columbia's Premier Thomas Dufferin Batullo, who was opposed to giving Asians the right to vote, federal policy forbade Chinese, Japanese, and Indians being selected for the armed services. Bill was not enlisted. Consequently, he worked for George Kidd until he received a letter in 1941 from his sister in Hong Kong, informing him of his father's death. Emigrating to Canada from Chuyang Village in Toi San, one of the 4 counties in Guangdong Province that were the primary sources of early Chinese immigration to North America, Bill's father made his fortune from real estate in Vancouver. With this wealth, he bought farmland in his home village, prime real estate in Guangzhou, and property in Hong Kong, where he had returned to live with his daughter. As the eldest son, Bill Chong traveled to Hong Kong to settle his father's estate. He was still in the colony when the Japanese crossed the border on the morning of December 8th, in coordination with the air raid on Pearl Harbor and the attacks on Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Thailand, and Wake Island. Mike Kendall's Z Special Force had had a few hours warning before the attack. In preparation, he moved his men into position in the hills surrounding the Singwon Dam in the new territories. However, given the swift advance of the Japanese, lack of direct communications with fortress headquarters, and challenges coordinating with the regular military units along the defensive gin drinkers line, they struggled to effectively carry out their plans. When the garrison commander, Major General Christopher Michael Maltby, ordered the retreat from the Kowloon Peninsula to Hong Kong Island on December 11th, Kendall and 2 of his men were stranded on the island in Victoria City, trying to organize an arms shipment in support of a planned attack on the Japanese by communist guerrillas in the northern New Territories. They were never able to rejoin the others, who continued to operate for several weeks on the mainland behind Japanese lines until escaping to free China or surrendering. For the remainder of the battle, Kendall and his two cloak and dagger boys engaged in anti-fifth column operations and supported the regular army, such as when on December 18th, in the dead of night, they went out into Hong Kong harbor in a small boat and attached limpet mines to a ship that was being used by the Japanese as a forward observation post, sinking it. That same day, Kendall was tasked by General Maltby to organize the escape of key military and civilian personnel, the most important of which was Admiral Chan Chek, the Nationalist Chinese government's political and military representative in Hong Kong. With the capitulation of the garrison on Black Christmas, the party made a dramatic escape on 5 Royal Navy mortar torpedo boats from Aberdeen, skirting south of Hong Kong Island, then north into Daipong Bay to Lam O on the west coast of the Daipong Peninsula. From there, with the assistance of what was to become the East River Column of the Guangdong People's Anti-Japanese Team, the escapers and naval crew were guided overland along the guerrillas' fledgling escape route to Weizhou in Free China. For his role in the escape, Mike Kendall was recommended for a George Medal by Britain's military attaché in Chongqing, General Gordon Grimsdale. However, he never received formal recognition for any of his wartime accomplishments. Bill Chong, on the other hand, was trapped. He had been staying at his sister's apartment while she had already left Hong Kong for Vancouver. Bill needed to find a way to get back home. One day, he noticed a wounded, unarmed Canadian soldier on the sidewalk in front, begging passers-by just for a drink of water. Then the Japanese soldiers came. While Chong surreptitiously observed from above, an officer in the party suddenly drew his pistol and summarily executed the Canadian on the spot. Outraged by such a wanton crime, Bill resolved to escape to free China and join the fight against the Japanese. In the meantime, the Chanchak escape party had broken up and moved on to their respective assignments. Mike Kendall's Z Special Force continued north to Siuguan, Guangdong's wartime capital and headquarters of the Chinese 7th War Zone. They arrived on January 20th, 1942, and would soon begin preparations for operations against the Japanese as part of S.O.E's China Commando Group, reporting to John Keswick, head of the Oriental Mission in Chongqing. Closely following was Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay Tasman Ride of the Hong Kong Field Ambulance. The former professor of physiology at Hong Kong University had escaped from Samsoibo POW camp with 3 HKU colleagues on January 9th. They were spirited to Weizhou along a similar route and by the same communist guerrillas as Kendall's party. En route, Ride's experience gave him the idea to establish this as a formal escape network. He presented his scheme to General Grimsdale upon reaching Chongqing on February 17th, and his scheme was approved. Doc Ride then returned to Siuguan on March 6th to set up his headquarters and began enlisting personnel. The organization, which was eventually given the name British Army A Group, or the BAAG, came under MI9 reporting to Grimsdale in Chongqing. Kendall's team was seconded to Ride as a forward operations group that would provide the BAAG with an offensive capability it lacked. It was at this time that the BAAG discovered Bill Chong. Ride personally recruited Bill into the organization as Agent 5-0, and it was in Siuguan that Chong met Mike Kendall. On June 25th, Bill's first mission was to establish contact with John Pownall Reeves, the British Consul General in neutral Macau, who was surrounded by the Japanese. To accomplish this, Bill was completely on his own. Although the consulate was closely patrolled by Chinese gendarmes in the pay of the Japanese, Chong succeeded in gaining entry by a clever subterfuge. A regular line of communication was thus secured between Ryde and Reeves. Over the remaining months of 1942, the BAAG established regular communications with all Hong Kong internment camps and set up the two escape routes that I previously mentioned. First, the East River route by an advanced headquarters at Waizhou. This passed through the communist-controlled zone in the new territories. Second was the West River route running through Macau to a second advanced headquarters at Sampao. The area surrounding Sampao is the ancestral homeland of many overseas Chinese, including Bill Chong's father, Susan Yu's father, and my wife's parents' families. On May 21st, 1942, Mike Kendall's squad was ready to leave Siuguan for infiltration into Hong Kong on their first mission with the BAAG. To proceed through nationalist-controlled territory, they only needed passes from the government in Chongqing. These never came. Instead, due to building Chinese mistrust of British intentions, Jiang Jieshi, known in English as Chiang Kai-shek, demanded the immediate withdrawal of all China Commando Group operatives. Kendall's relations with the Communist East River Column was thought to be a contributing factor. As an unarmed escape and evasion organization, however, the BAAG was spared and would continue to operate in China until December 31st, 1945. Kendall was transferred to S.O.E's Eastern Warfare School, India, at Sinagad Fort outside Pune. He spent a year there training groups to infiltrate Japanese-occupied territory in Southeast Asia. These included the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, commanded by Chun Ping, head of the Communist Party of Malaya. Mike's Z Special Force comrade, Robert Thompson, would battle Chun after the war during the Malayan emergency. Kendall was anxious to return to South China. He felt he could be of better use there because of his long experience and contacts in Hong Kong and Guangdong. Seeing how effective the BAAG agents like Bill Chong blended in with the local population, Mike conceived a plan to recruit the Chinese in Canada and train them just like the infiltration groups in India. He presented his scheme to S.O.E's Baker Street headquarters in London, and it was adopted with the code name Oblivion. From the time Mike Kendall left India in July 1943 to his arrival in Vancouver in April 1944, Southeast Asia Command had been created under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. S.O.E's India mission was renamed Force 136, and after much lobbying, London had concluded an agreement with the Canadian government to recruit, train, and deploy a select group of Canadian Chinese for special duties overseas. Yet, enlisting volunteers for Oblivion proved challenging in the beginning. The local Chinese community was divided. Many questioned why should they serve when their country didn't want them. Ironically, many whites were angered that the Chinese weren't doing their part, even though it was the government that was preventing them from doing so. An opposing group, led by Roy Ma, reasoned that by serving in the armed services, this would prove their loyalty to Canada and earn them the right to full citizenship. After impassioned debates in Vancouver and Victoria, Ma's argument won the day. Kendall worked quickly to fill his roster, drawing from the Chinese who had already registered with the Canadian Army. He sought volunteers with relevant technical skills and Cantonese language ability. Of the 25 men interviewed, 13 were accepted. The first was Captain Roger Kee Chung, a graduate in electrical engineering from McGill University and the first Chinese Canadian officer in the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals. With the support of Major General George Randolph Perks, VC, the Canadian Army Pacific Command's General Officer Commanding, a special training school was established east of Vancouver based on S.O.E's illustrious Camp X near Whitby, Ontario. Isolated Goose Bay on Lake Okanagan was in an area Kendall was familiar with when he was employed picking fruit in his youth. Today it's a park and historic site known as Commando Bay, whose wartime role is commemorated with a plaque. Commando Bay's instructors were led by Major Hugh John Legg, a British S.O.E communications expert who provided training to those selected for wireless operation. Kendall and 2 instructors transferred from Camp X taught the others demolition, weapons use, silent killing, unarmed combat, first aid, and small boat handling. Training ran 7 days a week from June to August 1944. The intensive daily routine began at 6 a.m. with a brisk swim in the lake and physical training. It ended at 9 p.m. when the exhausted men welcomed sleep. Some recruits first had to be taught how to swim, as public swimming pools in British Columbia were barred to Chinese. 8 of the Oblivion men had been raised by their parents to speak English as their primary language. So Cantonese classes were also given to them by Mike Kendall's Chinese-American wife, Betty. Pleased with the progress they were making, Kendall invited George Perks to Commando Bay for an exhibition of their cutting-edge equipment and demonstrations of their capabilities. Perks stayed at the camp for a few days and was impressed with the results. He also had an opportunity to get to know the men. As Kendall recalled, he'd sit around the campfire in the evening and be talking to them and digging in deep, into their feelings. One of our bright boys was Doug Jung, who later became an MP, and he hadn't even finished school then. He went back to law school after the war. But he was very articulate and very outspoken, representing the BC Chinese. He was actually fearless and told Perks exactly what the Chinese felt. We had several others, one from Toronto, 2 from Montreal, I think, all coming from Chinese communities in our major cities. Each had something to say. And when the thing really got ripe, Perks really took an interest in the matter, and he made them a promise then and there. He said, "Anything I can do, I'll devote a lifetime to see that you get the vote." As completion of the training neared, the Chinese Canadian volunteers were sent out on practice raids against installations along the British Columbia coastline. These included the Coastal Defense Battery on York Island, Esquimalt Naval Base, and the pulp and paper mill in my hometown, Powell River. Mostly, they were never detected. In September, the Commando Bay camp was closed down and all traces of it were removed. The wireless operators then flew to India Mission's headquarters in Meerut for a month-long course. On October 1st, the others, along with Major Legg and the 2 Camp X instructors, embarked from San Francisco for Australia on the American troop ship, the SS Lurline. They arrived in Melbourne on November 12th and underwent further instruction in the use of Japanese weapons, knowledge of the Japanese military, surveillance techniques, jungle warfare, parachute training, and submarine infiltration operations. The wireless operators in India rejoined the main group in Australia 10 days later. By mid-December, Mike Kendall with his Oblivion team were ready to return to the Daipong Bay area northeast of Hong Kong via Royal Navy submarine and reconnect with his communist East River Column associates. An undated directive addressed to Kendall from Colonel Caleb Grafton Roberts of the Allied Intelligence Bureau in Brisbane stated in part, "I am instructed by the Commander-in-Chief, meaning Douglas MacArthur, to convey to you and to your Chinese associates his keen interest and that of Allied leaders in general in your mission, on the exact nature of which the Commander-in-Chief is fully informed. You carry their very best wishes for your personal welfare and for the continuing success of your Chinese collaborators in your special and most important sphere of operations." However, it was not to be. Mike Kendall's mission may have previously been sanctioned in consideration of supporting a possible Allied amphibious landing on the South China coast. However, the new United States Forces China Theater Commander, General Albert Cody Wedemeyer, did not want an armed British Special Operations Force operating within the region under his command, especially one training and cooperating with communists, and possibly for the purpose of reclaiming colonial possessions. Wedemeyer, also acting in his role as Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff, quashed Operation Oblivion. With his work in Australia complete, Major Legge returned to Canada in late November of 1944 to vet an additional 15 Chinese to fill out the remainder of Oblivion's authorized allotment. This second group was sent directly to Australia for training, arriving in Brisbane on March 26, 1945. Meanwhile, in August 1944, under the National Resources Mobilization Act, the British Columbia government had called up resident Chinese for enlistment into the Canadian Army. Mike Kendall's positive reports to London on the caliber of men he was training at Commando Bay had convinced the British War Office that the Chinese in Canada were a suitable source of recruits for Force 136. On December 15, 1944, Canada's Cabinet War Committee authorized a requested loan to S.O.E. of a third group of 150 men. Of the 121 who passed the interview and volunteered, one was my father-in-law's uncle, Tommy Wong Guok Tung. Another was my mother-in-law's uncle, George Chandonlei. The enlistees were shipped in 3 drafts via Britain to the Eastern Warfare School in Pune. There, they took up the basic military course that Mike Kendall had set up in 1942. With the cancellation of Operation Oblivion, S.O.E. tried in futility to reconstitute the mission in a form acceptable to the Americans. On June 7, 1945, the Canadian Force 136 members in Australia who had successfully completed parachute training were reassigned to the Australia Services Reconnaissance Department, also known as Special Operations Australia. SRD's Operation Hippo saw Captain Roger Chung and Sergeants Roy Chan, Louis King, Norm Lowe, and James Hsu attached to a Commonwealth team led by British officer Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Basil Courtney. They were to connect with a Special Forces group already in Sarawak and Borneo, who were engaged against the Japanese in cooperation with local Dayak headhunters. The Hippo group arrived by Catalina flying boat on August 10th. Their objective was to liberate the civilian and military internees at Batu Linton camp in Sarawak's capital, Kuching. In India, Force 136 rookies from Canada began arriving by ship in March 1945. They were screened for suitability as paramilitary interpreters or wireless operators. Those who passed took either a 4-week interpreter course or 8 weeks of advanced operative training. Additional instruction was provided in small boat handling, beach landings, and parachute training. By June, 56 of the Chinese from Canada had passed their training. 10 would ultimately be attached to missions in Malaya with the Chinese Communist Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army led by Kendall student Chun Ping. On one of these operations, Sergeant George Chun was parachuted into Curling in Selangor State on July 28, 1945. He was the interpreter for their Galvanic Green Patrol Liaison Team led by Major C.E. Maxwell. Unfortunately for Chun, the unit's 2 Nationalist Chinese wireless operators and the MPAJA guerrillas spoke different dialects of Chinese. Somehow, though, he was able to manage. However, due to political rivalry, the Nationalist Chinese wireless operations were murdered by the communist guerrillas. By the time the Galvanic Green group had set up their jungle camp, the war was over. For most of the Force 136 volunteers in India, like Tommy Wong, fighting ceased before they could be sent on missions. At noon Japan Standard Time on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced to his subjects that the Japanese government had accepted the Allies' Potsdam Declaration. The resulting power vacuum in Japanese-occupied territories created a period of uncertainty, with some Japanese units refusing to surrender. George Chun and his Galvanic Green team sprung into action, providing medical attention to their communist guerrilla associates and the inhabitants of nearby Kuala Kubu Baru, the district capital. They also organized Japanese work parties to tidy up the town. Galvanic Green was finally relieved by the British Army upon its arrival in Malaya in September. In Borneo, the Hippo team members were variously tasked to contain the Japanese until their formal surrender, collect weapons, maintain order, prevent guerrilla reprisals against the Japanese, and deter Iban massacres of local Chinese residents. It wasn't until October that the Force 136 Canadians were withdrawn from Sarawak. Captain Roger Chung recommended the military medal for his 4 sergeants. These were awarded to Chan, King, Lo, and Hsu in 1946 after their return to Canada. One might think that volunteering to serve in the armed forces of the country one is born in is the ultimate expression of loyalty and would invoke the right to full citizenship, including voting. In the minds of British Columbia Premier Thomas Patullo and Norman Robertson, Canadian Under Secretary of State for External Affairs, this was not so. To them, the more compelling claim was compulsory service, as under the National Resources Mobilization Act. With the calling up of the Chinese in British Columbia in August 1944 to fulfill S.O.E.'s request for Force 136 India recruits, this may have prompted the province in February 1945 to extend the vote to currently serving Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and First Nations personnel, and veterans from the First World War. Those 21 years old and over were then able to vote in the federal election on June 11, 1945. By war's end, the attitude towards the Chinese in Canada had changed noticeably for a variety of reasons. With the declaration of war in 1941, Canada was China's ally in the fight against the Empire of Japan. Chinese Canadian civilians also gave ardent support to the war effort through work in war industries, service in the Red Cross, and victory loan subscriptions. A robust economy meant there was much less competition with whites for jobs. Consequently, the Chinese community made a concerted push in 1946 to have the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act repealed. Broader political considerations also came into play. Since its passage, the act may have hampered trading opportunities with China. On December 17, 1943, the United States had already repealed their Chinese Exclusion Act that had barred Chinese immigration. Furthermore, discrimination towards Canada's non-white residents was hypocritical with respect to its pledge to the United Nations Charter. Accordingly, on January 1st, 1947, Canada's Chinese Exclusion Act was abolished, and the Canadian Citizenship Act came into effect. This gave all Canadian Chinese citizens the right to vote, enter the professions, and allowed them to reunite with their families in Canada. As a result, Douglas Jung, one of Kendall's original Oblivion recruits, used his veterans' benefits to gain a law degree from the University of British Columbia. He was called to the British Columbia Bar in 1954. After entering politics in 1956, he became the first Chinese Canadian elected to Parliament in the federal election of June 10, 1957. While in government, he served as Canadian delegate to the Legal Committee of the United Nations. After the war, Mike Kendall returned to Hong Kong, where he became Far East manager for Philippine Airlines. He and his wife Betty raised two children, Vivian and Harry. Mike passed away in Hong Kong on May 17, 1973. Marjorie Wong, author of The Dragon and the Maple Leaf, stated, "Mike Kendall is important to the Chinese Canadians in both the Canadian military and civil contexts. Without his request for volunteers for the China operation, and the exceptional quality of the 13 he initially recruited, and the subsequent British War Office request for additional volunteers on his recommendation, it is doubtful whether they would ever have been called up in British Columbia." Bill Chong was the British Army Aid Group's most accomplished agent. He was captured by the Japanese 3 times, yet managed to cheat death and save countless lives. After the war in Hong Kong, when Chong was a witness at the trial of a Chinese collaborator, he recognized 2 people in the courtroom whom he had rescued. One was Leonardo Horacio Dalmado y Castro Jr., the president of the General Military Court. The second was the prosecutor, Marcos Alberto da Silva. Bill continued working for British intelligence, carrying out missions into China from Hong Kong. In 1946, he was formally presented with the British Empire Medal by Governor Sir Mark Young. Chong remained in Hong Kong until 1976, when he retired to Canada. He opened a Chinese cafe in Chemainus on Vancouver Island and died in 2006 at age 95. Viewing history as people occupying a point in an interconnected web, the story we tell depends on which thread we tug, then choose to follow. To fully understand a person's impact in life, we might think of them as a proverbial dewdrop striking a 4-dimensional web, sending vibrations through space and time and into an infinite rabbit hole that is the wonderland of historians. Thank you.
Wonderful use of the word rabbit hole there. You snuck that in there. You're clearly a regular.
I certainly did. And of course, this did not happen in isolation. And I'd just like to thank these people for their assistance and also providing materials for this presentation. I also have a list of sources that I consulted, and I have to mention, of course, that Brad Sanqua is really gave me some inspiration in terms of how to really interpret what the Battle of Hong Kong was for Canadians, and this certainly influenced part of my thinking in putting this together.
Um,
And so here's for the rabbit hole.
Brilliant stuff. Well, yeah. Lots to think about. We've got a few questions in the sidebar. I'll bring to your attention in a second. But my first thing is, as you know, Rick, and as a lot of viewers know, one of the things we've often addressed is the how you measure the success of commando raids. Now, as we heard from you, some of these initiatives taken by these people ended up not quite being used for in practice, but they had this result. Who would have thought that the creation of a unit for a purpose in the war would have this benefit to freedoms post-war? So that's another metric for measuring these sort of unusual units that come about during the war is the effect doesn't have to be immediate. The effect can be several years down the line and not in an area you're expecting it to make. So that's a really interesting thing. And lots of congratulations, therefore. The first thing I thought I'd mention is the photo you had towards the end of the woman in the factory there. Norma said, my mum worked in that same factory during the war. I wonder if she knew the woman in the photo. So that's extraordinary. Was that slide 50? Was that something like that, wasn't it? I'll bring that, or 50, wasn't it? Yeah. I'll bring that one up again. Yeah, that would be extraordinary. You've already had the link to Susan. If you ended up having a link to Norma's mum, that would be extraordinary. That's your threads analogy there in
Absolutely.
Action.
Absolutely.
So that's quite cool. But here are the questions. So the first ones were really early on in the presentation, Rick, and they were about the neutrality of some of the countries in the area there. And as someone who's lived in that part of the world, so Ian Carr, these are two questions. Wonder how neutral Macau obtained supplies during the war. Must have been an issue. And Peter said, why did the Japanese respect Portuguese neutrality? They ran roughshod over territories belonging to far more powerful adversaries. Now, we had that show a couple of years ago about Thailand and its economy in World War II, and we are going to be doing a series in the future about neutral countries and exactly what that means. But do you have a kind of an answer for the countries in this region that were at least by definition neutral during this time?
Well, I mean, Macau was an interesting thing because it was completely surrounded, and the only other area that of, you might say, Portuguese neutrality would have been Goa, which of course is under control of the British. So Pownall Reeves was it was actually pretty extraordinary what he accomplished, because I mean, we're not only talking about just the Portuguese administration at that time supporting the local people being sort of cut off, if you will, but because it was neutral, it wasn't that they weren't able to get any supplies in at all. But the thing that complicated Reeves' situation in particular was because of thousands of refugees that came from Hong Kong, who were under their were nominally considered Portuguese, so they weren't incarcerated, or they weren't kept in Hong Kong. The Japanese allowed them to actually leave, and they went to Macau. So even though that nominally they were Portuguese, it was a bit of a mixed situation, and Reeves ended up having to be responsible for basically feeding and clothing and housing them. So that was a massive challenge. But in terms of the neutrality question, what Peter brought up, my understanding, the main reason why the Japanese respected it is because if they didn't, then that might bring Portugal into war against the Axis.
Yeah.
And the Germans didn't want that. It was convenient for the Germans to have Portugal neutral. So I think that was really the main reason why they respected it.
Okay, thank you. So Peter O'Connell asked earlier on about how the Japanese would have classed Chinese Canadians as in terms of prisoners of war. I mean, we've talked a lot on the channel about, for example, 8th Air Force personnel being found outside of uniform and how that affected their rights as a prisoner of war in the ETO. When these units were being formed, was any consideration made as to how these people would be treated? Under what classification would they be treated as Chinese? Do you have the answer to that?
Well, I mean, the whole reason why they were recruited was to blend in with the local population. But it was under the understanding that if you were caught and the Japanese found out who you are, I mean, you'd be executed. So there's
Yeah.
no question about that. But in terms of blending in with the local population, which is exactly what Bill Chong did and why he
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
successful, he would just be treated like any other civilian, and which was, I mean, not terribly well. Japanese soldiers just abused and killed locals for sport. Fortunately for Bill, who was actually captured 3 times, uh, he was able to avoid that end.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is really continuing how I was chatting with John, Rob, and Jack on Sunday, and as someone who's lived in that part of the world, which I haven't even traveled to that part of the world. Obviously, Susan's got connections over there. In the historiography, you mentioned at the beginning, we talked about the importance of bringing China into the World War II story. And obviously, if you're Chinese, it's been part of their history for a long time, and millions killed in the war. But do you see that there has been a corner turned in terms of what I don't want to kind of say Western historians, but I can't think of a better term, Western historians bringing in the more local points of view of World War II into the narrative?
Yeah, no, I can see that happening more, and also with overseas Chinese, so to speak,
Yeah.
that they're becoming more they've become more interested in their history, and of course how the war and any service of any of their relatives or ancestors impacted what their life is today. So this is really kind of the crux of my story, is how something that seems very innocuous, that we don't even hear of much in Canadian military history or Canadian history. The Battle of Hong Kong is like a shameful thing that isn't to be remembered. But yet it did have, from what I could see, is this pretty significant result, not only for the Chinese community, but it also impacted, in terms of Asians general, it also impacted the Japanese and the Indians.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's been this movement, I don't know if this is the right word, in recent years to officially change the dates of World War II from 1939 to 45 to 37, or I think possibly 36 to 1945, but I think 37. But when I speak to people like yourself and Rob and these others, and we realize of all the things that happened in this area after 1945, you could make the argument that 1945 certainly doesn't bring a crisp, neat end to problems in that part of the world. In some ways, it just makes them worse. The whole communist aspect that we haven't really dealt with, and Chiang Kai-shek and all that kind of aspect in China. But the conflicts there just keep on going. One morphs into another one that morphs into something else, and arguably takes us right up to 2024. Whereas to some extent, the war in the Mediterranean has kind of definitely ends in World War II. I suppose you could argue that the breakup of the Soviet Union kind of continued World War II, and Yugoslavia, I guess, continues. But this end we bring in 45 with VE Day and VJ Day is not necessarily the concept you would have of that conflict if you lived, for example, in the parts of the world you've been talking about today.
Yeah, no, certainly, certainly with respect to China, that I mean, first off, we call it a world war. So, why put the start of the first why put the start of the Second World War in September of 1939 in Europe, when it basically, what ultimately how it grew, it involved Asia and involved the Pacific. So that war was already started in as you mentioned, in 1937. And now there's even debate. Oh well, do you go back to 1931 when the Japanese took over Manchuria? Is Manchuria rightfully part of China at that time? I mean, it's a chaotic period where you had the collapse of the Qing Empire, the Qing dynasty, and then you have this very chaotic Republican period where there's this jockeying for power, and nobody's in control of the country, and nobody ends up being in control of the country until essentially October 1949. And even then, I mean, to call China a country at that time is very generous. I mean, you can't think of it as being like a European country that has a strong central government and a tradition of unity and this idea of nationalism. I mean, most Chinese, their main loyalty is number one to their family.
Yeah.
And number two, it's to their extended family, then their village. And beyond that, everybody else is hostile. And when you take a look at how the Nationalist Chinese army behaved when it was going through the countryside, I mean, they acted like locusts. So they were not they were not welcomed by most of the local people, which was a completely different situation under the communists, who realized that their success depended upon basically getting the hearts and minds of the local people. And of course, they have this revolutionary goal that involved that. So ultimately, that was what was happening in China. The main story was really the Civil War part of it, and that broke out in 1925 in Shanghai, when Chiang Kai-shek had the Green Gang basically massacre the communists, and that war was only interrupted when the young marshal Zhang Shuixiang, I believe his name is, who was a warlord essentially. He ended up kidnapping Chiang Kai-shek in Xi'an, and Chiang Kai-shek was forced to get into a united front with Mao Zedong to fight against the Japanese. So that was just an interruption between ultimately who was to gain control of what we now know as China. And that's why I think, like you said, it's not a story that ends in August 15th, 1945, certainly not in this area. It's a whole continuum, and that ends up in other countries resulting in this decolonialization, which is very much a part of what Mike Kendall's training actually helped, because in the Malayan situation, Kendall says that he was actually asked if he would fight against Chongping to defeat the Malaysian communists during the Malayan emergency, and he said, "No, I trained him too well. Find somebody else." And it ended up getting his other student or cohort, Robert Thompson, back from said Special Force Hong Kong days.
Oh, and one of the things that, as I kind of began my investigation into the history of China in World War II, really, although I'd read a little bit over the years, when I did the first Sino-Japanese week on the channel a couple of years ago, and and I read Rana Mitter and I read Richard Frank, and I've read there's been other areas of World War II where I felt that a single book has just about sated my need for it, like Finland in World War II, for example. I read a book, I thought, okay, I could go deeper into that, but I feel that one book has given me a kind of a fairly strong overview, and I can kind of not put that one to bed, but put it on the shelf. But when I read Rana Mitter and Richard Frank, I just realized I've opened a massive, massive, great black hole to another whole aspect of history that has to really understand that part of the world, you've got to go back beyond prior to 1931, you've got to go back prior to the 19th century, you've got to go back to kind of feudal times, and you've got to bring it right up to 2024. So, you can't just sort of, I think I'll just kind of get a grip on China in World War II in a weekend. You're not, folks, you're not going to kind of do that. It's worthy to try that, but it's just opening up it's more than a rabbit hole. It's a rabbit warren leading to a rabbit kingdom. But at least people like yourself and Rana Mitter and Rob Lyme and others have tried to kind of open a window to us. And it's also, the other thing I want to say is it's very hard for us, and this is maybe a cliched view of it, but as Westerners to look at that part of the world and try and understand that part of the world does work an entirely different way to the West. And you kind of got to understand culture, and you've got to understand as you do language. And it's just, it's a daunting prospect for anyone watching this to just think, oh, I'll just dip my toe in the Chinese theater in World War II. I'm hoping you kind of agree with me there. It's a massive, great subject.
Oh, absolutely, it is, and you know, when you have that sort of knowledge and you can you see what you're able to have a better idea of what's going on there. And then you just imagine somebody from Europe who has no experience in that area at all as a soldier or as an intelligence operative dropping in there with absolutely little time to get that context. I mean, how disoriented it could be, and it's something that ended up showing how the importance of that knowledge was basically when the United States went through McCarthyism, and just because of the whole communist Red Scare sort of thing, they totally obliterated the State Department and their intelligence aspect of people who had the expertise, who could advise well on how to deal with a situation. A number of people who were purged through the McCarthyism was they were what were called mish kids. So they were children of missionaries who were in China, and they were born in China, and they grew up amongst Chinese, and they were fluent and they understood, and so they were very effective in working for organizations like OSS, for example. But come McCarthyism, and they were absolutely purged. So
yeah, well, sorry.
No worries. So if their expertise would have been recognized and utilized, it makes you wonder how things might have changed, whether or not relations with China after 1949, if it would have been a little different and maybe not so adversarial, and that lasted until basically 1971.
Yeah. Well, lots to think about, Rick, which is always the best type of show. So we will leave things there. So, folks, I'll remind you again, Rick has made the transition from viewer to guest, so you too can make that transition. It's been done before. So if you are someone who's got a subject or a book you've self-published or a website you run and you would like to talk about whatever it is that your angle in World War II is, please do get in contact via the World War II TV website or via one of my social media accounts, and I will follow it up. But right now, folks, I'll remind you, we have the question and answer session with John Marshall tomorrow. So it's about 1942, so not just the Pacific. He has written about all theaters in 1942, so we could even ask him questions about China if we wanted to, because that's part of the remit of his book. I always like chatting to John, so think of your questions for tomorrow. But he's not doing a presentation. We're just answering questions. So we can maybe bring it back to 41 and nudge into 43, but 42 will be the subject of that. And as always, please consider becoming a patron, consider becoming a YouTube channel member, buy my guest books, go to their websites, follow them on social media, and we can all learn together. So thank you very much, Rick, and thank you very much, viewers, for your questions. Rick,
thanks, everyone.
Will you come back with a second presentation at some point, double tag with Susan?
Quite possible. I mean, I'm open to ideas. I'm not sure where this will go. I mean, my other background in web development, I'm very keen on the idea of putting together a community for all of us here, where we could get together beyond these shows and collaborate more closely, and potentially generate projects that just might not have actually happened otherwise.
Well, that came up in the sidebar because it seems that Darren Little always has a connection with every one of the stories we do. Susan, you have these connections. Norma's mum may have worked in the same factory. So if there was some means where a website of World War II viewers where they could put in their family information that could somehow via a family tree thing connect with other people's history via campaigns, theaters, locations, years, units, that would be amazing to think what kind of spider's web of information that we all we're all watching these shows independently, but we must have these links, some of which we know about and some of which we don't know about, our relatives passing through the same areas. That'd be extraordinary if we get that kind of thing off the ground, but I'll get in touch with you about that maybe later on. But folks, that's it for me. I've done 2 shows today. I'm off to have a cold beer. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, Rick. Cheers, everybody. I will see you again. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.